stuff in there of a different nature. It seems like they buried in the middle of it a bunch of things that will drastically change rules of evidence in sexual assault trials. It seems to be buried because essentially it's just a numerical order of where it falls in the criminal code. So there's a few different types of things going on in there, which are mostly just cleanup, which is why they're trying to say, oh, this is just housekeeping, right? Because there is a lot of housekeeping in there. So if the courts have deemed something unconstitutional, it'll just sit there for a bit, but the code doesn't get changed until they have bills like this where they kind of, take out the bits that have been deemed unconstitutional. Like there was a couple areas that reversed the burden of proof and in different areas of law. So there were those things, and then there was eliminating things that aren't really necessary anymore, like challenging somebody to a duel and saying that you practice witchcraft, and so things like that, which are quite humorous and definitely need to be cleaned up in the code. But then in a totally different nature, there's some stuff in the 276, 278 area, and I think 273 that all have to do with sexual assault. And they are, there's a constitutional or charter statement that goes along with the bill that acknowledges that these changes may violate sections 7 and 11D of charter rights of the accused. And so those are things that are basically your right to full answer in defense and things like that. So they acknowledge that there are some concerns that they may violate the rights of the accused by the changes. So what they did was they changed 273 was to add that a woman can't consent or a victim can't consent of either gender to sex if they're unconscious. And of course, it seems like it doesn't need to be said. Interestingly, feminists have a problem with that because they're concerned that judges will interpret the wording of can't consent if they're unconscious to mean that that's the line. So as long as they're still conscious, they can consent even if they're extremely drunk. So they're concerned that the judges will make it so now it doesn't matter how drunk a woman is, and unless she's full-blown unconscious, that won't kick in. So feminists have a concern with that part. Then 276 is, and this is, for me, the scariest change. 276 has to do with the twin myths in law. And it's talked about a lot. The twin myths comes up when people are talking about sexual stereotypes. And that is mostly referred to as prior sexual history of a complainant, that you can't go into prior sexual history. Now, the twin myths, simply put, means that a woman having a prior sexual history, not being a virgin or having had sex with somebody a number of times before, that fact does not make her more likely to have consented, and so this is the twin parts, more likely to have consented or less worthy of belief. So whereas in the past, basically, you just say if the woman wasn't chaste, then she lacks credibility and she's low class, and we shouldn't listen to anything that she says. She's less worthy of belief, right? And then any variations of that, even if more subtle. So those are the twin myths, and those are absolutely barred. In addition to that, there's also recognized myths about rape, being that the doctrine of recent complaint. Just because somebody doesn't immediately run to police doesn't mean that they're less credible. And there's a number of things like that were named in a decision referred to as a WAN check. So in this bill, they're going to expand prior sexual history to anything of a sexual nature. So that means anything flirtatious and any references to having to the sexual experience itself. And by itself, I mean the subject of the inquiry. So the act of sex that's being put on trial as to whether or not it was consensual, any references to that sexual activity would then have to go through a special application process, right? So, like I said, it's difficult to get people excited about law because it's so dry, it's and so technical. But in simple terms, what it means is that any text messages, like in the Mandy Gray case, she had sent a text saying, "Come out and meet me for hot sex," right? And then she had later claimed that he just accidentally showed up at the bar at the same time, and that's how they ended up meeting that night. That would have to go through this process in order to be introduced. And everybody believes this is a response to the Ghomeshi trial. So in the Ghomeshi trial, we're looking at a letter that was mailed by one of the complainants saying, "I love your hands," and talking about how he'd opened her up and it was such a great experience having been with him that weekend. And of course, as soon as she'd returned home after the event in question, she had sent him an email saying, you kicked my ass last night, and now I can't wait to fuck your brains out, right? So that, of course, is obviously of a sexual nature. And the defense lawyer, clever Marie Hennon, one of the best in Canada, used the element of surprise to catch her lying. And it was relevant because she had told police that she never wanted to speak to him again and that she was very upset by what had happened and she tried to avoid him and all this other stuff. So it wasn't to say that the content meant something about the actual event. The reason it was allowed is because it contradicted statements she'd made, right? So all this stuff would have to go through an application process, in which case there's no element of surprise left, and the complainant would also have the ability to have legal representation at the hearing. So she can attend, she can see what evidence you're going to use against her in court, and she can have a lawyer try to argue against you to block it from evidence. So that is completely new, and that's what lawyer Joseph Newberg calls catastrophic. Andre Marin's argument was that in the Ghomeshi case, it had been over 10 years since the event, so how was she supposed to remember the email? And Joseph had said, well, why do I have to remind her? She wrote it, right? And my point was that even if it doesn't go against her credibility, right, because it's been a long time, she can't remember it, it goes against her reliability. Because in terms of false accusations, sometimes it's not actually a malicious lie. Sometimes their memory has been affected and they sincerely believe that they've been assaulted and they've forgotten how they actually felt about the event. So even if she didn't remember the content, or if you reminded her of the content, the problem is the accuracy of her memory is now shown to be flawed. So one of the reasons why it's so dangerous right now to give advance knowledge of this material that's in your possession, in the possession of the accused, is because aside from the advocacy narrative, that it's apparently a myth that a woman will behave in any way at all. So any behavior, even behavior where she's literally throwing herself at him, trying to have sex with him again afterwards, any of that behavior does not apparently mean that she wasn't assaulted. Doesn't mean that she didn't have a negative experience. They're allowed to act any way they want, and what we're missing is what behavior would be inconsistent with rape. They don't tell us what would be a sign that they're lying, right? And we're getting to a point where it's impossible to prove that you're innocent. They're taking away all avenues of proving you're innocent. With this assumption, you wouldn't be charged or accused unless you were guilty. And that is absolutely a horrendous legal principle to try and instill into our system.
Next question. Yeah, I followed that case, but once he was acquitted, I kind of didn't. Were the ladies charged with making false statements?
No, absolutely not. There was actually a person who was following the trial who made a complaint to the Canadian Air Force about Lucy Ducater, saying that she had engaged in activity on becoming an officer because she's a member of the Air Force. And as far as I know, they opened an investigation for about 2 or 3 days and then closed it. And no, not a single thing happens. And in fact, I happen to know that the third accuser, whose name is under publication ban, is also falsely accusing somebody else or trying to benefit from other sexual assault claims.
Yeah, that was, I know in the States, the Violence Against Women's Act has a rape shield paragraph where identities of accusers are withheld, and it allows for repeated
This is an interesting in terms of advocacy, and I was talking earlier about how sometimes people's opinions do change, right? I had a very strong starting position on publication bans. I wanted to campaign and advocate for getting publication bans on the accused name as well. Mm-hmm. And I read one article written by a very clever barrister in the UK, Helen Rees. And after reading her one article, completely changed my position, and I now think we should have no publication bans for anybody. There's a few reasons for that, but the biggest reason is because it's important to have a open public justice system that can be watched closely. And if you start putting publication bans on too much material, then all of a sudden it goes darker and darker and darker until everything is happening in a star chamber. And so the open court principle is really important. And there would be benefits what they want with the accused is if his name is published, usually a him, then anybody else who may have been assaulted could come forward and help out with the prosecution. To the same degree, like I said with this third woman, if the accuser's name is published, then anybody who's been falsely accused by them could come forward and offer assistance as well.
So it's not likely that we would see the rape shield laws disappearing in Canada. So given that it's
not likely and actually not desirable, I think there's some really good reasons to have the twin myth.
Well, okay, but let me just be clear. So you were saying that, you know, the publication then of the names,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that we're going to see that for the accusers, that they would be named.
Mm-hmm.
So given that that's the case, does it still make sense that the accused should be named?
Well, it could be a good temporary measure, and Christy Blatchford, who is, because she's a journalist, very much against any publication bans on anything, has actually publicly stated that she is starting to think that it would be a good idea to protect the name of the accused at this point. And I always concern myself with, is it practical to ask this, right? I mean, there's some stuff with human rights that are very good ideas, very good moral principles to live by, but in terms of encoding them in the law, how do we practically enforce them, right? And given the internet and what we've seen with the hashtag #MeToo stuff and all of this publishing people's names, anonymous accusations, or is basically people are being convicted by the public based on a Facebook post or a single tweet, right? So how are we going to enforce publication bans? I think that there's some impracticalities to it. And to muzzle journalists so that the names can't be published in mainstream media, but then it could be all over the internet anyways, would be impractical.
So with the vetting of what evidence is applicable in any case, is that going to be in an open court?
The vetting of...
Yeah, what is going to be determined as evidence, right?
Okay, so these applications, they already exist. And they are, if there's something that would normally be barred, but it's relevant to an issue, a live issue in the case, then they can make an application and they can ask for a judge to review it, to allow it. A very clear example and a precedent-setting example is a case of R versus Cboye, and our current Justice McLaughlin actually wrote that decision. It was the first decision she ever wrote as a Supreme Court judge. The accused wanted to introduce evidence that the complainant had had sex with a different individual within 24 hours prior to the event that she was accusing him of. And the reason was because she presented bruises on her body saying that they were caused by him, and he wanted to argue that they could have been caused by somebody else. So it was a live issue at trial, and she agreed that he should have been allowed to present that evidence. Right, so this is something that you would say, what does it matter if she had sex with somebody else? Well, in this case, it actually did. And these are case-by-case decisions.
You were talking about Bill C-51 adding this vetting process.
Yes. No,
So
it's enhancing. It's enhancing the process.
Okay.
So, yeah.
The vetting process is an open court, is what you're saying right now?
It currently exists for some things. And then 278, which I mentioned, that's a third-party record search. And so it's to protect things like if somebody's been to a therapist and you want to use the therapist's notes, and you think that they're relevant to your case, then, and that would be, for example, if somebody says that they'd totally forgotten about an event, it's an historical accusation, then they've gone to a therapist and suddenly they remember, right? Like these recovered memory, which has been debunked and yet seems to continue existing in some ways. So the third-party record search does that, but it also does things like in the Ghomeshi trial, Lucy Decatur had told a journalist that she had a covert network of people who'd been victimized by him, and that she was sort of the head of a covert network. And on the basis, I believe that was the basis they used, they managed to successfully get a third-party record search of all the communications between the accusers which provided them with about 5,000 messages between Lucy Dicatere and the third complainant. So these exist, but they want to expand it to evidence that's already in the possession of the accused. So they're not things that you need to try and get permission to use, or other witnesses or whatever. One of the suggestions I heard made in the standing committee from the bill was that it would be more effective and expedient, because you don't know what evidence you're going to use until you hear the testimony first, and then you hear what they've said under oath. That instead of having to do this prior to trial, where it's like a whole separate process, which will incur more legal bills and slow things down, that they should just do it very similar to what they do now with voir dire, but mid-trial. So after.
Okay.
Thank you both for speaking again. It was a great event. Mine is on a slightly different angle. It's on the more cultural and social dimensions of gender issues today. Even if a publication ban goes into effect, there's still court of social justice, if you want to call it that. Any woman at any time could always just send the name of one or multiple men on social media and say, I was assaulted, I was raped by these people. And suddenly these men, whether they are guilty or innocent in the final account, their lives are immediately disrupted and often permanently damaged to the point where they can't recover. And the women in these cases, very few people stop to pause and reflect. Okay, it's an accusation, it's an allegation. Is it true? Is it factual? Did it really happen? But what the reaction you often see is just, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry to hear about that. I feel bad for you. They get sympathy and they get attention and they get basically a big warm embrace from the world, which is like the pluses and minuses as soon as that is announced, before the verdict of an eventual trial are very lopsided. And to me, what this is evidence of is a culture that, whether it's explicit or implicit, it sees women almost always as innocent victims who are never held accountable or responsible for hardly anything. And men are always guilty, oppressive perpetrators who are fully responsible for every evil crime that happens all the time. I'm exaggerating only slightly. But my question for you is, how can we make a change in the right direction by seeing, there's two sides to that. One is recognizing that men are sometimes victims and we also have our unique gender-based difficulties that we have to deal with. But on the other side, that women are not always innocent and they sometimes need to take responsibility and be held accountable for their actions in such a way that they're held to an equal standard as men, as opposed to a kind of a special sympathy that I think in the public eye is given to women. So how would that change come about?
I wish I had a simple answer for that. I don't know. I think that these attitudes that you're talking about are not just sort of in the culture, they are product of our evolutionary history, you know. Men were the protectors, women were the protected. If you look at, you know, the survival figures of the Titanic, you know, first and second class women, it was 95%. First and second class men, 21%. The richest man in the world went down with the ship, you know. So like this is deep in our psyches, and I think it's going to be difficult for us to move it. And we also need to start telling the truth about the fact that we are not being equal in the way that we are telling ourselves that we are all for equality these days, that gender equality matters to us. But we are being anything but equal in the way that we are applying these things. Now, are there some practical things we could do? Like, I've been thinking about you know, these, you know, the Hollywood scandal, the Me Too thing. Like, if you look at free speech discussions and the limits on free speech, well, one of the examples that is given is crying fire in a crowded theater is not protected as free speech. And the reason is because a person could know that it's probably going to cause a panic and it's probably going to lead to immediate harm to people. Now, what about making a claim like this about somebody's, 20 years ago you did this to me, and the expectation clearly from our experience is that that claim will likely lead to that person having severe reputation damage, career loss. Look at what happened to Kevin Spacey over something that was claimed to happen 30 years before. Should that be protected under free speech? Or is it a similar thing to crying fire in a theater, right? I think that we need to look at these things very carefully and say, what really can we do? It's not easy to know.
Well, I think that one of the things that we can do, and one of the things I think women want to do is, certainly Camille Paglia wants this. As she said, feminists fought for the right for women to take risks and take chances. And they said, we are equal, we can take responsibility, and we can take responsibility for ourselves. And this is why she's so furious with modern feminism, because they're infantilizing women and they're claiming that women need to be protected, and to some degree we're saying they need to be treated like children. And I believe that majority of women want to be seen as capable and responsible, and you do people no good by catering to them and solving problems for them. People improve and grow as an individual when they learn how to solve their own problems. And I think this is one of the things missing from the current narrative of victimhood and stuff, is that what I found, and this is the reason why I rejected feminism when I was younger, that I was more empowered by, instead of becoming a victim and blaming everybody else, by trying to figure out what I can do to prevent something from happening again, what I can do to improve my life, right? As opposed to, and the reason for this is because you can change yourself. You can change yourself fairly easily. I mean, unless it's a habit, and it takes a little bit of work. But you can do something instantly to change the way you behave, the way you respond to things. But you can't change other people. Other people have to change themselves, right? So I think that's one of the things we can do, is try to focus on people taking responsibility, seeing the power, the empowerment of actually being responsible for your own decisions and your own actions. So, but this question of what to do about the destruction of people's lives with a simple tweet or a Facebook post, I have actually been thinking about this quite a bit right now too. And there's a bit of, I mean, I don't like to use the word evil, but there's a real malice going on in what people are doing right now, because it goes further than just destroying somebody's reputation in life. The people who are doing this, and as a group, ganging up and almost stalking people, they want you fired. They want to make sure nobody else will hire you, right? Like Kevin Spacey, right? He's dead to the world of the entertainment industry right now. Nobody will hire him. But beyond that, if you employ yourself, they will go after your means of funding, like trying to get Patreon to shut you down, trying to just get you cut off from PayPal. So now we're getting into the question: are they violating human rights, your right to life and liberty? Because you need shelter, you need food, you need to be able to make a living. And they are so malicious that they don't just want you fired, and they don't just want you suffering and miserable. They want to make sure that you can never gainfully employ yourself again. And they watch over time, over a lengthy time period. And that is, I think, criminal. And we're looking into that right now.
I think that what we're seeing is essentially the same behavior that we saw years ago in lynch mobs. Mm-hmm. I think it's lynch mob hysteria.
And it goes along with this outrage culture on the internet that's just feeding the frenzy.
Yeah, I think part of that whole advocacy is for men. Part of the solution is, as you said, David, we do our own work and get a self-acceptance for our feelings and needs. And then once you have that self-acceptance for your feelings and wide range, and as men we can allow ourselves to say, hey, that hurt when that thing happened. Then people, I've had probably about 6 different conversations in the last week with women. And when I'm able to express myself and acknowledge how that's scary when things are being said about men, and how do I separate from that? And it's hard not to be impacted by the hashtag #MeToo, and sure, it starts off by saying, this guy did it, and then the next line is, men are evil, right?
Yeah.
So, and just telling people that this is the impact on me, it opened their eyes. Like one woman said, you know, it wasn't until I had sons that I realized boys are human beings, like boys are people. There's such a lack of empathy for men, and I think the
Yes.
solution to that is we have to start talking that language.
But let's not get stuck in the victim story, right? It's empathy, yes.
I don't think it's stuck in the victim story. It's naming a fact, like having a feeling. It doesn't mean I'm stuck in the victim
Yes.
story. I'm just saying that when that thing happened, it affected me. I'm not stuck there.
Yes.
And
The
I'm not
myth
saying
of
those
male
people need to be
power.
punished for it.
Yeah, The Myth of Male Power is an incredible book, and I think that that's the kind of advocacy we're looking now, is for people to write more books like Warren Farrell did, where you're talking about the male experience of the world, right? And you talk about your struggles and your strengths and point out to people. Like, I always wondered, why do women take women's studies? Because you grow up female, so you already know what it's like to be a woman. Why aren't they interested in learning about men? And, you know, and that's actually an interesting thing to look in. Can we have men's studies for women, so women can learn about what men are experiencing, and then women's studies that are catered to men to help them understand, you know, things that are different about the way, you know, women experience things? It's like, I don't need a course to tell me what it's like to be a woman. It seems a little crazy to me. But I think Myth of Male Power is a really great model for the kinds of things that people can look into, the storytelling that men can do. And I really appreciate that you're saying, like, don't go into the victim narrative. That doesn't help you. It doesn't help anybody else. Focus on, like, these interesting stories of male bonding and things
Yes.
that are male experiences.
Yeah, I have a question for both of you, I guess. But I think when you talk about issues like assault or stalking or whatever, I think one of the most effective strategies for women is to find another male nearby and say, oh, hey, can you help me out? This guy is stalking me. And so the male response will be, look, well, I'm a decent human being, it's not okay to be stalked, and so on. Yeah. Do you think that there is a sort of a lack of education or training or stereotypes for men to accept these roles as sort of, well, to call out other men who may be engaging in activities like that, and to sort of self-police in a more effective way?
That's been promoted, actually. There's sort of been a campaign to try and get men, I guess he for she, it would be the official title for that, getting men to identify problematic behavior from other men. It's,
That's shaming and blaming.
yeah, and this is the thing, is like, and they have like men's groups at universities that are actually run by feminists who aren't interested in the well-being of men at all. They're interested in training men to be better servants to women, right? But this running to men to protect you can be a really big problem, because it's proxy violence sometimes, especially when there's no questioning of the narrative that somebody's assaulted you. And we've seen men actually be murdered by other men after a woman has accused the guy of raping them. So
There's a men's studies program at the Stony Brook University. On the board of directors is Gloria Steinman.
yeah.
So it's
Okay.
not, so.
Parts here. How do you reconcile, it's a Canadian Association for Equality, but it's a Center for Men and Boys. How do you reconcile that? And the other thing is, I'm interested in, from the point of you getting involved with CAFE to opening the doors of the Ottawa Men's Centre. Can you just sort of give us a little bit of a narrative?
Sure. It's very easy to reconcile that. So the Canadian Association for Equality, equality is for everyone. Right now, men and boys are the ones who are underserved in terms of services that would bring them more towards equality. So men's issues are under-addressed, and that's why CAFE focuses on them.
Well, I'm thinking of other things too, like Big Brothers and United Way, these kinds of organizations that are, you know, the community chest.
Yes.
Have you
We're
approached-
talking to
Yeah.
lots. Yeah.
They're receptive?
Yes and no.
Ottawa's a tough community with
it's a
men's
tough one.
issues. Like, they shut down 2 screenings of the Red Pill, was it?
Well,
Or
one.
just one? They just one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, like in Toronto, they seem to, after Big Red, they seem to have kind of learned that they just kind of feed the machine when they come out and protest, but in Ottawa, they're still extremely active.
Yeah,
And,
I mean, they still
yeah.
feed the machine. You know, we had about 70 people signed up to see the Red Pill at the Mayfair Theatre, which is a private community theatre. The feminists persuaded that theatre to cancel. And then, so we moved to City Hall, and we had 3 screenings and, you know, ran about 300 people through altogether. So it worked in our favor, but yeah, they shut it.
In terms
they
of
shut
the
it
men
down.
and boys question, I get asked a lot about why I talk about false accusations, but I don't talk about rape. And I was just like, you know what, there's a lot of people out there talking about rape already. So, but there's nobody talking about the false accusations sufficiently. So that's sort of the reason why, is to create that balance. But it is tricky because, like I was saying, is like it's very polarized, right? And you know, the 2x4 over the head thing is really, I think, a really good analogy. That when they're coming out this extreme and they refuse to just say violence, it's always male violence and toxic masculinity. And you have that kind of language going on. In order to get into the conversation, you can't just say, well, you know, I think that's a little extreme. You have to come out swinging on your side as well. And then the hope, though, is that we get from that position to where they're going to calm down. Because, you know, they've been countered effectively so many times that now they're going to have to come into a rational discussion. Same thing. It's like nobody's out there for men and boys. Nobody's out there for the falsely accused. So that's how we have to balance the conversation.
So going back to the question about the stalker. So with the stalker, what we was, you know, scenario is the man stalking the woman is afraid.
Women actually quite prolifically stalk men. That's
Yeah.
that's one of the areas where there's more charges laid against women on that
But
type
this
of
is,
thing.
but
Yeah.
this is the narrative. So the woman is the only one with feelings in that situation. She's afraid. The man is just a bumbling robot zombie thing that's just after her.
Mhm.
So I think this is where, again, men, like if you sort of try and have some empathy of what's going on, that guy's probably lonely, he doesn't have support. So I think this is where we need to advocate for support for men instead of blaming and shaming.
Mhm.
Instead of saying, oh, he's the bad guy, everybody gang up on him, let's kill the zombie. Yeah, I think that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I have an opinion that, you know, outside of the vast number of laws that exist and the fact that apparently we break a bunch of bylaws and things like that all the time, I think it's pretty easy to follow the main rules of society, like don't kill people, don't, you know, stalk them, don't do things like that. So when people can't follow those simple rules, I think that there's a mental illness, right?
Yeah.
So actually, and this is one of the problems, I mean, with the prison industry and just throwing people into jail. We know that jail doesn't actually help people in terms of rehabilitation, right? And mental health is definitely like pretty much anybody who is engaging in some sort of criminal activity, there's some sort of a mental deficiency there that needs to be addressed, for sure.
I look at society and how we tend to respond to men and women in this, with this structure. I contrast compassion and accountability. Okay, so, you know, if we want to be fair to people and then we need to have compassion for them and also hold them accountable for their behavior. Now, what society tends to want to do is have compassion for women and accountability for men. That's the thing that just plays out most naturally for us. And I think when we do a little bit of thinking and we push ourselves a bit, we can get to compassion for men. That's not too much of a stretch. The one that's really tough is accountability for women. You know, that it seems to me that one will come last.
Yeah, just a general question. So what are the key issues that you feel needs to be improved in terms of equality, let's say in our legal system and in our society? Is there like, you know, top issues that you are working on that you consider important that needs to be improved?
Well, there's, I mean, so many. If you want a list of men's issues, you know, we've played them. But, I mean, I think that the biggest issue that I'm aware of, I think, is family court. I think that that's so biased and the you know, the consequences are so horrific in people's lives. You know, I mean, I look at family court and it was designed, civil law was designed for the wealthy, you know, for barons and kings and that. It was marginally cheaper than going to war. You know, not a whole lot, but this generation, you know, or the last 50 years, is the first time in history that the middle class have used civil law. family court. And the reason is because it's the first time there's ever been something that's worth bankrupting themselves for. That they care more, people care more about their kids, about getting access, having their kids in their lives, than they do about the accumulated capital of a lifetime. And, you know, and that's such a tragedy. It's a tragedy that you know, I think of. So anyway, I think that's the biggest issue. It also seems to be the most deeply entrenched.
In the criminal courts, I would say, like, you have to keep in mind there's phases of damage that are done to guys who've been accused, and it starts as soon as you find out that you're being accused of something. It gets worse when you're actually charged. Then you start incurring, you know, big financial debts with legal fees even at the beginning. Then there's the cost of the trial, and you know, God forbid a wrongly accused person gets wrongly convicted. Now you're stuck in jail sometimes trying to get through an appeal process, which takes years and years and years. So there's phases of damage that are done, and I think that we have to keep in mind that with the legal system, there's also different phases as well. I think we need to empower police, and a large number of them know what's going on. We need to empower police to do proper investigations, where we don't just press charges on a #believe basis or an attempt to improve statistics, right? That we need to demand that they do proper investigations. And then the next phase would be to make sure that when prosecutors determine if they're going to go forward with charges, they really need to closely look at the amount of evidence they have and fairly ask the question, is there a reasonable prospect of conviction? And then I think with the legal system, we need to protect the rights of the accused, right, to make sure that they have full answer and defense, that they retain the presumption of innocence, and that the burden of proof remains where it is. So those are really important, not just for sexual assault, but across the board. There's no reason why sexual assault should be any different. And then we have to protect our judges so that they retain their judicial independence, and that they're not going to make verdicts, come up with, you know, design their verdicts to please the court of public opinion. Because we're allowing them to be hauled in front of the CJC now whenever they make an unpopular decision. And I have seen the effects of that, where judges are searching for ways to convict when they shouldn't. So there's a bunch of phases in there to look at.
You mentioned how one of the best ways to kind of like deal with the reality of what's going on is to go through the grieving process. And a lot of people get stuck on the anger stage. So like it's like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. What would you suggest of like ways to recognize, say, the other stages past anger and how to deal with that? So like when getting to like what would be the bargaining stage? Like I guess with like kind of the depression stage is like this is the reality that you don't maybe like that you don't want to accept. But like what are some things you would think of being able to recognize when you're bargaining with trying to not, I guess, accept what's going on?
You know, I hadn't. That's a really good question, and it's not one I'd actually thought about. But so let me just blue sky it. So would bargaining look like if I was a bit more of a feminist guy, you know, then the system might look after me a little better, or
maybe even like the he for she kind of thing. Would that kind of
maybe
sound like where it's like, okay,
don't
well,
know.
maybe it's not all guys, but we'll admit that there's a bunch of bad, which I guess is kind of somewhat true, right? There's obviously bad people, but still maybe putting it for just men still and not recognizing it as like a person thing.
Maybe so. I don't know. Hadn't thought about those particular stages.
As long as your mind is replaying the incident, as long as it's revisiting it and you're still having emotion, or it's coming up on its own accord, even if you don't think you're really having emotions about it, but you're playing the story over and over, your mind is still stuck on it, so you're not finished. When you're finished with it, it just, you know, you remember it, it's not like you forget it, but something has to sort of reach in and someone asks you a question, it's like, oh yeah, I have a story about that. But it doesn't have that emotional weight, it doesn't have all of those circulating thoughts or trigger other thoughts or trigger other. So that's how you know.
I think you need to focus on positive as well and look for the tools that exist to help you out. And if they don't exist, then look to create them. In terms of like, you know, the he for she thing, there has been cafe events held that are she for he. And, you know, as much as it's men under attack right now, there's a miscalculation going on the part of these, you know, crazy people. And that is that they're not just hurting men. I get contacted all the time by the mothers, the sisters, the daughters of people who've been falsely accused and wrongfully convicted, who are desperate, who are woke, who's like, I can't even believe this happened to my family. And women are getting active, they're getting angry, they're being personally affected. And for every one man who's falsely accused, there's a number of women who are affected. And so they're actually converting a lot of women over to, I mean, what more proof can you get that there's a problem than all of a sudden your innocent son is in jail? You know, and this is, I'm getting contacted by these people more and more. I would say like a good third of the people who reach out to me are actually women trying to get help for their brother or their son or their husband. I think we have to deal with the personal attacks that are happening on people. Some people it's just not worth it, or if they are out there, they're anonymous, right? And there's a really big difference between being an activist who's willing to put your name to it. You get taken a lot more serious when you're actually using your own name. But then as a result, you have to be willing to put up with Toronto Sun articles that are factually incorrect, that are slandering you. You know what I mean? So we have to, I think we have to make it fun to be a man again, for one. And we have to get pride in being a man again. And we have to create a resilience that, which is one of the reasons I love the company of men, because you are resilient, you are resourceful, and you know, and creative, incredibly creative male energy that drives you to be the providers that you've classically had to be in the past, that drives you to create bridges, learn how to build bridges that won't fall down. And you know, like the men have so many great qualities, and I think we have to just really focus on the positive side, like this whole discussion was called, you know, positive activism, or focused on positive activism. Instead of getting sucked into those negative things, if we focus on and build the true narrative of how brilliant and how wonderful men are, then we can get more men who are less afraid to speak out.
I'd like to say something about that too. I think that there are a lot of men and women who are supportive in a private way. You know, you get them over a beer and they'll nod their head and they'll agree, but they're not willing to stand up. So I think we can find ways to tap them, and one of them is opening centers for men and having them be fundraise. You know, like going to the general population. People will give money for something because they can do that privately. I think that we can tap into people in ways that they are comfortable to contribute. When not everybody is willing to step forward and join a group or be a visible advocate.
Yeah, not everybody's a leader, and followers are incredibly important. It's, there's ways of being a good follower, and that is when you find somebody who can do this, who's got the ability to get up and speak, then, supporting them, especially when they're under attack, and trying to just support those people who are good spokespeople and the leaders is important as well.
Yeah, not so much a question as some comments and observations, I guess. I'll be 70 in a couple of weeks, and I've been working with men for about 30 years now, very close to it. And goddamn, we're in a tough place. The lines of femininity and masculinity are being obliterated recently, for about 50 years now. And it's causing all kinds of problems. Our divorce rate is high, but actually our divorce rate is way higher than say it is, because the number of people that live together and separate and never get married doesn't count in this divorce rate. So it's probably running about 90%.
90?
I would guess. Divorce is, because not that many people getting married. They hook up, they may have kids, they may not. And what the result is that we've got a generation, and almost two generations now, of young men and men out there that have been raised without any good male role models, without their fathers. And they've been raised by their mothers. God bless their mothers. They do the best they can, but their mothers are not fathers. They're not equipped to do what men are supposed to do in the home. And so we got all these men running around the world that are lost, they're confused, they're angry, they're pissed off, they don't know who they're supposed to be. And men left to their own devices will get into trouble. They're ticking time bombs. So the only solution that I see is for the men to stand up and be the men they were meant to be the men that Diane talks about. Thank you, Diane. And if we don't teach our young men and women how to love, honor, respect, appreciate, and embrace the differences between men and women, the beauty of femininity and the beauty of masculinity as to what it should be, we're fucked.
I'm an individualist, and so I think really the thing that I'd like to see with just people in general is that you focus on what makes you unique, and you value those things that make you different. And then when we get into relationships, you find people where you're going in as two wholes instead of a half of two halves of a whole, right? As people say, my better half and things like this. Sure, there's certain ways that men and women combine. You're a bit more of a traditionalist than I am. I think kind of where we're at right now, what we can really do immediately is just start looking at people as individuals, not representatives of a gender. And there's women who are very masculine in a lot of their behaviors, and that's incorporated, and then they still have feminine qualities, and that can be appreciated as well. And then there's men who are more sensitive, and they're artistic types or whatever. Like they maybe have characteristics that are seen as feminine, right? Both genders actually have masculine and feminine within them, right? So there should be an appreciation. If you want to love yourself, you got to love both parts of yourself, because we all have masculine and feminine, sides to us. So I think by this polarized debate where we're supposed to pick which one is good and which one is evil, that's destructive just as a whole. And I think we can start immediately by just dealing with people. I can't remember the description that you gave, but you talked about this in your presentation, where you value people. It was the honoring of the man as for his character.
For his character.
Look at each other and value character. Try to be a person who's of good character and value. And that'll enhance not just your relationships with the significant other, but it'll enhance your relationship to everybody around you. Well, I agree with you. We need to have strong male role models, and we also need to celebrate those male role models instead of disparaging them for being members of the patriarchy.
Paul Nathanson, who wrote a series of books with Catherine Young about misandry, says that every social group that is a distinctive social group needs to have a social identity that is based on where it feels it has a role in society that is 1, distinctive, 2, necessary, and 3, socially valued. And if you don't have that, then you're floundering for an identity. And I think men have. I think you're right that men used to have a social role like that, and it was about protection and providing and fathering. And the protection and the providing have kind of gone largely because the women have stepped into those roles as well. And so perhaps, the fathering is the only one that might be left, and we are seeing that even that is under attack, that fathers are seen largely as assistant mothers. I think there's something to what you say, but I also think there's something to what Diana is saying about developing ourselves as individuals. I think that there is a need for different types of parenting. What Paul Nathanson says is that mothers are about loving unconditionally, and fathers say, you have to earn my respect. I don't know whether he's right that that's the essence of the difference between the roles, but the notion that there is a difference, I think, is important. Women have built in with their reproductive biology, they have their role sort of essential there. So I think it's very easy for them to look at men and say, well, what's your problem? Just be an individual. And I think there's something that to what you say. I think that men do need to craft a new identity in the world that we can be proud of. That is about being men. And I think there are some things about being men that we can look at historically and transport into the new world.
Please give a round of applause for our first speaker.